All right, so the authoritarianism of Ukraine is on full display. It's very hard I guess if you turn on normal news. I saw a bit of ABC this morning. I don't think they mentioned this, but Ukraine is not a democracy. Hasn't been a democracy arguably ever, but it certainly isn't a democracy today. It's less of a democracy now than it has been at any point since 1991. Volodymyr Zelensky, the figurehead of the Maidan regime, which has been in place since the coup of 2014, has just basically outlawed opposition in Ukraine. He banned 11 parties, including, most importantly, the main opposition party, the leader of the opposition coalition, which was called the Platform for Life. It was also, I also saw it on Wikipedia as Opposition Platform for Life, so I'm not sure how you're supposed to say it, but this was Viktor Medvedchuk's party. That was I guess I don't know if you'd call him an oligarch if he doesn't have political power, because he was stripped of his assets and put under house arrest. So I don't know if he'd still be considered an oligarch, but just a big rich guy in Ukraine who was close to Russia. He was the pro-Russia guy. He was like the one pro-Russia guy left in Ukraine as far as political leaders go. He was placed under house arrest a long time ago and had his assets seized. But nevertheless, his supporters and his allies, were still represented in the Ukrainian parliament, and they were the biggest opposition party. But opposing the Maidan regime is no longer okay. You're not allowed to do that. Zelensky is claiming that he is outlawing this party and then a bunch of other left-wing or socialist parties by the looks of it. It's interesting. We have the left here in the West that is absolutely cheering him on. They are, in the words of Alex Stein, Zelensky stands. Yet Zelensky is outlawing socialist and left-wing parties. Why? What are the grounds by which he's outlawing these parties? Russia collusion. I literally saw the words Russia collusion in the headline. I don't know if that's a direct translation from his original Ukrainian speech, but the fact that a Western news outlet would be dense enough to use the phrase Russia collusion and not think that people are going to immediately dismiss these charges, it's beyond parody at this point. And so now if you look on Twitter, very easy to find Western so-called liberals and American Democrats saying, playing, they're not even playing their own little whataboutism game that they talk about. They're just straight out justifying it and saying, well, this is totally understandable during a time of war. Sure, maybe outlawing opposition isn't the most democratic thing in the world, but hey, they're in a war, so democracy's out the window. These are known Russia colluders. Known by whom? I guess probably by the Western media. If you're labeled a Russian stooge or a Russian pawn or a Russian troll, then you can be denied political rights. And so if in that case, obviously these people would support the same thing here in the West. So keep that in mind. You've got these idiots like Lindsey Graham that want to start a war with Russia. Hey, guess what? Once the war starts, Lindsey, the Democrats are still going to call you a Russia colluder. No matter how much you hate Putin, you're still a Republican. You're a member of the opposition. And hey, to quote Lindsey Graham, freedom of speech is a great idea, but we're in a war. I believe he said that in reference to the Afghanistan war, but it's going to be the Dems who are doing this, because it's the liberals in the West who are spearheading all this stuff, who are standing for Zelensky. And so the World Economic Forum types, the Trudeaus of the world, the Obamas of the world, although Obama himself has obviously faded into the background, and I don't think that he's as active behind the scenes as a lot of people think. But I mean that archetype, the sniveling, arrogant, elitist snob. Those people are very happy to rush to defend the banning of opposition, and they're happy to use phony Russia collusion as as their justification. Now, in the case of this Viktor Medvedchuk guy, he's certainly a I think a known it's not controversial. Yeah, he's an overtly pro-Russia guy, because there are pro-Russia people in Ukraine. It's right next to Russia. A lot of people there speak Russian. So yeah, it makes sense that politically you're going to have some people who favor being nice to Russia in their foreign policy. But it doesn't matter. It's not like they're, accusing him of any real crimes or anything like that. It's just straight out persecution. And it's the same thing they do here. They don't need evidence. They don't need some, real justification. They're happy to use Russia collusion, as they did with Trump. Because at the end of the day, in your beautiful democracy, you can make sure that you always win as long as it's illegal to oppose you. And anybody who does oppose you is labeled a Russia colluder, a traitor. And I hate to break it to all the liberal Democrats who might somehow stumble across this video, but if it's illegal to oppose the policies of politicians, you don't live in a democracy. I think Western democracy has always been largely a sham. It's always been way overhyped, the extent to which there is political freedom in the West. But now they're just completely exposing themselves by slobbering all over this overtly authoritarian regime out of Kiev just because they have Putin derangement syndrome. The regime in Kiev that was installed by the Maidan coup is, at the very least, as bad as the regime in Moscow. You don't have to defend Putin or say, well, Putin's not so bad, in order to recognize that. You can say Putin's very, very bad and still recognize Kiev is also very, very bad. That is, if you actually believe in consistent principles of political freedom and freedom of speech, which Western liberal Democrats clearly do not. They've made that abundantly clear over the last 6 years, really going back to Brexit. These people hate democracy. They hate free speech. They hate the concept of political opposition. They think it's perfectly fine to crack down on freedom of speech if their enemies are the ones who are being cracked down upon. When they're the ones who are being cracked down upon, then it's terrible authoritarianism. That's what you have to, once you figure out that these words that they use, they don't mean what we think they mean, they don't mean what the dictionary says. Democracy means you are, I can't even say pro-liberal because these people aren't liberal, that you're pro-World Economic Forum, let's put it that way, or you're pro-U.S. State Department, you're pro-Washington think tank. That's really what it comes down to. That's how you can tell what a democracy is. Is it a government that is friendly to the State Department and to the World Economic Forum and to the various Washington think tanks? If the answer is yes, then that's a democracy. If it's a government, whether it's elected or not, can be a perfectly elected, in a totally clean election government. If it's opposed and unfriendly to the U.S. State Department, to the think tanks in Washington, to the World Economic Forum, to the Koch brothers, George Soros axis, then yes, that is an authoritarian state. But where I live in Realville, a democracy is a country with an elected government that you are allowed to publicly criticize and that you are allowed to try and run against in an election to change the policies of the current government, to put new people in office. That's how I think of a democracy. An authoritarian government I think of as one where you're not allowed to question the policies of the government, and where the government, the elites run it, they do as they please, and you're not allowed to criticize that. And so that's kind of the spectrum there. How much, how much influence and feedback are you allowed to, as an ordinary citizen, to have on the state? And when I look at Ukraine and Russia, I see two countries where in neither of them you're allowed to have a whole lot of influence on the workings of the state. Of course, that's also true for the United States government, but in the U.S. we haven't gotten to the point of disappearing people and wrapping their face in duct tape and seizing all their assets yet. We're close, but we're not quite there yet. We haven't gotten to the point of literally outlawing opposition parties. We just sort of have written our laws in a way that you don't have opposition parties that spring up. They just make it very difficult for an opposition party to do anything, so they don't need to outlaw opposition parties. That's why we say that, there's a uniparty in the United States, because you have these two major parties that write the rules so that nobody else can get in, and so that they can kind of, try and control debate and regulate, the Overton window. In a more parliamentary country like Ukraine, it might be harder to do that, and so you do end up with these smaller parties that can advocate for interests that are outside of whatever the elite bubble is in the capital, and so therefore they have no choice, if they're going to suppress that opposition, other than to outright ban the party. Now, this wasn't the only announcement that Zelensky made yesterday or today. Hard to say with the time difference. I can never keep it straight. He's also going to ban, well, he already pretty much banned the opposition media in Ukraine, way before this war got started. About the time that Joe Biden was inaugurated, I guess he called it like a gift to Biden. Hey, look, I got rid of all the opposition media. Aren't you proud of me, Democrats? Now he's taking the step to merge all TV into one single state TV network, so that they can have, uniformity of information during the time of war. Again, not something that you do in a democracy. You only need one, political side, and you only need one political faction. You only need one news network. You only need one president. It reminds me of a phrase from back in World War II. What was it? Oh, yeah. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Although I would have to imagine that the Führer, that the Azov crowd had imagined that they would be fighting under somebody other than Zelensky, since he is one of God's chosen people. One prediction I'm willing to make is that when all is said and done, assuming, what it looks like is that the Russians are going to bite off a big chunk of Ukraine, all the Russia-friendly parts of Ukraine, leave a rump state, as I've talked about endlessly. Zelensky will not be long for this world. At least he won't be long for, being a president of this new, smaller Ukraine that will be, in which the neo-Nazis will have a much stronger influence, and there'll be a bigger percentage of the population. Remember, Zelensky won on a platform of reconciliation with Russia, and he won largely with the support of the eastern parts of the country, which are now going to be lobbed off by Russia. And so the folks in the West, from what I understand, Zelensky was not their guy back then, and he probably won't be their guy now. I mean, who knows? Maybe after all the war stuff, and maybe that will change their hearts, and they'll say, like, oh no, he's one of us now, and the Nazi faction will not be strong enough to derail his re-election, in the future. But I could easily see him becoming a Churchillian figure who is ousted, like, as soon as the war is over. So anyway, if anyone, assuming that there's a lot of people listening to this who are, like me, neutral, the majority of you kind of share my opinion on this, if you have your brainwashed liberal friends, castigate you for that, or maybe ask you nicely, how could you be neutral on this? This is such a black and white issue. You've got good guys who are the Ukrainians, and you've got bad guys who are the Ruskies. Why don't you just kindly, ask them, hey, did you know that Ukraine outlawed the political opposition parties? Did you know that Ukraine not only outlawed the opposition news networks, but merged all, TV into a single national TV network, so that there is, you turn on your TV, you get one state media channel, because that might be a good example of why you don't want to go all in on supporting this government in Ukraine and say, you know what, maybe I don't really want to pick a side here because I don't see anybody who seems to be all that great. Maybe this is a complicated issue, and I don't know the full details and the full history. I can't appreciate it entirely, and there appears to be bad guys on both sides. That would be an honorable and reasonable and humble stance to take for most Americans, but we're told that's not acceptable. We have to act like we know everything about the situation, because of course we're told, that okay, here's everything you need to know, and people just, they take that, they take that for granted. When you turn on Fox News and MSNBC and they're telling you the exact same thing, you think, wow, well, if these two agree, this must really be the whole truth. And that's the problem with our limited form of opposition that is, prevalent here in the United States. It's getting better. You have Tucker, who is, real opposition. But if the authorities here ever, find a good enough pretext, he will go the way of Viktor Medvedchuk. Viktor Medvedchuk, by the way, has reportedly escaped house arrest, so good for him. I'm surprised that the Ukrainians hadn't offed him yet. And so it's pretty much, well, I shouldn't say a certainty, but it's expected that when all this is said and done, and Ukraine is either under total Russian occupation or has been cleaved in at least two parts, which I think is the more likely thing. I hope that happens. I think it would be a terrible idea for the Russians to try and, hold on to Western Ukraine. And like I said, in Putin's original speech, he argued pretty strongly that Western Ukraine is not Russian. So if he takes eastern into central Ukraine, cleaves it off, leaves Galicia on its own, Viktor Medvedchuk seems to be the top candidate as, the leader of the political opposition, whose base of support is in the east, to be the next leader. I don't know if they would call it president or what, probably, because I guess in Russia, Putin's called the president. This is a sidebar, but if I were to build a government from scratch, I would come up with a different title. Because, when the United States was formed, president was a new idea, because they wanted to create something that wasn't like a king. It was the idea. President was supposed to sound modest. Now that every government in the world has copied the United States and calls their leader the president, even China now, which really disappoints me, it's lost its meaning. I would create something that just has a different term. I like how the German countries, call them a chancellor. You have the Chancellor of Austria, the Chancellor of Germany. Of course, they have a president, too, but that's just because after they overthrew the monarchy, they're like, well, what do we put in place of the monarch in our political structure? Because the Chancellor was technically below the monarch. But anyway, all that aside, I do hope this wraps up soon. I think it's terrible that it had to come to this. I do blame my own government for this, because they are the ones who goaded and pushed the Ukrainians into this. They're the ones who who staged a coup or provoked a coup in order to put the most anti-Russian people in Ukraine in power. It's the thing, when diplomacy breaks down, when you put in place leaders who are not diplomatic, that's how you kind of start marching down the path to war. Ukraine is right next to Russia. It's unsustainable. It's always been unsustainable to have people in that government who just hate Russia and want to persecute Russians who live in their country and who want to destroy Russia. In the same way, it would be totally unsustainable to have leaders of Canada or Mexico who hate America and want to destroy America and persecute any Americans within their border. You want to be on good terms with your neighbors. That's a pretty basic tenet of foreign policy. You don't have to like your neighbors, but you need to be civil. And at the end of the day, Russia is a bigger country, and Ukraine is a smaller country, as Kamala Harris said. And Russia is going to do what it wants, because the United States is not going to intervene militarily, no matter how much their their pawns in Kiev may beg of them. And so I would rather that this gets settled as quickly as possible, that the war ends, and that whatever happens, happens. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.